Hi there, and welcome to Flip the Script Season 3, Episode 6, The Zeigarnik Effect, and the 3 different pattern interrupts that can help you drive conversion. My name's Becc. I'm going to be your guide for today's session. If you do me a favor before we jump in, there is a deck for this session. So if you go along to the flipthescript.co website, and you can click on Free Sales Training Hub Season 3, and if you could download the deck so you can follow along at each step of the way. And once you've done that, let's go ahead and jump into the content. So I first want to start with an agenda. This is going to be a pretty lengthy agenda, but I promise a really fun session. So we're first going to start off with the Zeigarnik Effect, what that means for the sales world and how it applies. Number 2, we're going to go into the first type of patterns. The first type of pattern is going to be the pattern of what normally happens between a prospect and a prospector. We'll then go into pattern interrupts for that pattern via email, via call, and via objection handling. We're then going to go into pattern number 2. So pattern number 2 is going to be the pattern that normally happens, what happens between a buyer and a seller. So that's going to be pattern number 2. And then we're going to go into how to disrupt that pattern. So there's a number of different components that go into that pattern. The pattern that sellers sell things that prospects don't need, that they talk poorly about others, that they only show up when it's something in it for them, that they withhold negative aspects of our products, that they only talk about themselves, and that they don't know their prospects. So we're going to go into each one of those patterns, how they manifest, and then how to interrupt them to effectively drive more conversion. And then we're going to go into pattern number 3, which is the pattern of the parent and child ego state, the 3 different ego states, and how can you interrupt that pattern. So these patterns are going to be the most toxic to your selling process if they see you as this or if you hit this pattern. So we're going to go into ways of what the pattern is and how do we disturb it and disrupt that pattern effectively to get more results. So first, let's start off with the Zeigarnik Effect. So the Zeigarnik Effect, essentially, there was a researcher, her name was Bluma Zeigarnik, and she's Lithuanian. And effectively, back in the early 1900s, she was studying in Berlin, and she noticed something really, really interesting. She was at a cafe one day, and she noticed that all of the waiters and waitresses, that they were effectively, when asked to recall the tabs, they could more effectively remember during the day the tabs that weren't closed versus the tabs that were closed. So she had a theory, and she decided to trial this theory out. So she took a couple of cohorts of people, and she essentially assigned them 20 different small tasks. So for cohort A, she did 20 different small tasks, and cohort B, she did 20 different small tasks, but she made the minor interruption for 3 tasks. She interrupted the tasks before they were completed. She then asked both groups after the tasks were completed, and she did this multiple, time and time again to prove the theory out, but that the group number 2 was more likely, 90% more likely to remember the tasks that were interrupted over the tasks that were completed. So this is what we would call the Zeigarnik Effect, and this was later proved out by Kurt Lewin, who Bluma Zeigarnik was studying underneath. But basically what it discovered is that within our pattern of memory, within short-term and long-term memory, essentially you have much, much, much dramatically higher likelihood of remembering or remembering anything if the pattern or the task is interrupted. So imagine a song, essentially, that the last note is not played, or a story where the last part of the sentence is not finished. But essentially, you're 90% more likely on average to remember that type of activity versus one that came within completion. So in terms of the patterns, and again, the 3 patterns are, there's a pattern between a prospect and a prospector, a typical pattern between a buyer and a seller, and then a pattern between a child and parent ego state that's going out to play. But essentially, if you interrupt that pattern, the value of it is not only do they not negatively associate you with all the typical things they do with the sales rep, but they also, at minimum, are 90% more likely to remember you as a prospector. So pattern number 1 is going to be the pattern between a prospect and a prospector that typically pays out. So the pattern between a prospect and a prospector is going to come to manifest in one of 3 ways. What prospects expect to see from you via email, what they expect to see from you via call, and then what they expect to see from you via objection handling. So let's start with email. So email, this is going to be the typical pattern of a sales email. It's the first line is going to be some form or fashion of my name is blank and I'm with blank. So it's basically an introduction of yourself or the reason for my outreach is, and people put in some type of generic line. So that's going to be the pattern of a normal sales email. The second line usually is going to be the value prop. So we're the number one blank provider and we work with blank, VPs of sales to help them X, Y, and Z. The third line usually is going to be some type of social proof. So we work with LinkedIn, we work with Microsoft and, Spotify to help them X, Y, and Z. These are the results they were able to accomplish. The fourth line is going to be some type of CTA. What I mean by that is a call to action, where people a lot of times say, I'd love to jump on a quick call this week for 15 minutes to chat about it. And then there'll be some type of assumptive close, looking forward to it, looking forward to it. Let me know what time works for you. And then it's a signature, cheers, all the best regards. And then they sign it as a rep. And then phrases that are commonly used with an email that I've seen in the industry are going to be happy Monday, hope you and your kids are safe during these uncertain times. I'm just checking in, just circling back, just bubbling this to the top of your inbox. Just wanted to, check back in. Hope you had a great weekend. I'd love to, look forward to. Why don't we connect for a quick chat? These are all common phrases within email. So Google did a study on how you read emails. You start at 2:00 and you go clockwise. So what that essentially teaches you, and this is on desktop only, what that teaches you is that your prospect wants to know the end of the first line first, then the end of the last line, then the beginning of the last line, and then the middle. So essentially they want to know who you are and what you want before they want to know anything about your company. So if you're hitting any of this common language via email, it's not that it's bad language, but it just means that it's sales language. And so typically what people are going to do at this point is they're going to log into the email and they're going to log out of the email because they know that it's a sales email and it's not to them in specific. So this is a pattern of a normal sales email. So I would fill this out in your own terms in terms of things that you think about that sales reps consistently say. And I would then make that the quote unquote, the holy book of things that you cannot say. Because if you say these things, then you are going to enter into the normal profile of a prospector who doesn't know them, who doesn't add value, and increase the likelihood inherently that they're going to log out of the email and not want to read the rest of it. So a great option of how to do this, of which I'm a huge advocate of, is personalization. So you can do a lot of different kind of quote unquote gimmicks or things that make you stand out. But one that is very fail-safe in my opinion and extremely respectful is some level of personalization, meaning having some level of data about them. So this is effectively how I interrupted the pattern over email, among all of the reps that I've trained. Is, knowing something about them, really just in the base of it, it's going to be an effective pattern interrupt. So again, the pattern of a normal sales email is that you are talking about you and that you're not talking about them. So this can help interrupt that pattern so it's more likely that they read it. So your body from a stimulus perspective can't absorb all the stimulus at one time. So it's designed to identify things that look different from normal to pay attention to them from the threat perspective. Should I fight or should I flight in this moment? So personalization is a great way to stand out as something that is not typical, for someone in the sales email case scenario. So personalization bucket one, I'm going to be very brief here. If you want to know more, if you go into personalization point, I do an entire episode on this. But content that the prospects have self-authored is going to be the first bucket. Speaking engagements, webinars, article post. Bucket number 2 is going to be anything that they commented on but didn't actually author themselves. Commented on, shared, liked, or liked posts. Personalization bucket 3 is self-identified traits. This is profile line, company line, about me line, or headline. And this is going to be anything that they wrote about themselves. Bucket 4 is going to be junk drawer, which is going to be anything non-business related about them. So this is personal interests, volunteer experience, languages that they speak, schools attended, or things that they're interested in or following. Bucket 5 is background centric. So this is tenure at a company, professional trajectory between companies, recommendations they've given or received, etc. But this is going to be things about their background that's professional. And then bucket 6 is going to be company level. So anything in specific to their company. Hypothetically, this isn't really, it's not a liquid, it's not a solid, it's a gel. So it's not personalization because it's not one-to-one. You could send this to multiple people at the company, but this is going to be the least amount of efficacy in terms of response rate anyway. So in terms of personalization at large, you can use this effectively, bar none, as a pattern interrupt so that people read the email. The second pattern is the pattern of a cold call between a prospect and a prospector. So the normal prospect relationship over cold call usually is going to be the sales rep calls in and they say something like, "How are you today?" The person says, "I'm good." They blow through that. Even if the person says, "Ugh, I'm good," the prospector blows through that. Or even if they're happy, they say, "I'm great." They'll go, "Great. Well, the reason for my outreach is," and they'll go right into their pitch. "We're the number one blank that helps blank do blank." And they essentially, because they're nervous, a lot of times they're nervous that the person's going to hang up. So they'll start to speed up their tone. They'll start to go, "We're the number one blank who helps with yada, yada, yada." And when the prospect answers what they question, they don't dig in deeper. They start going on their pitch and they're trying to close, get another meeting. So there are 3 ways that I'm interrupting this pattern in specific of a cold caller in terms of the structure that I put together. So if you want to know more about the structure, if you go over into the written assets hub, there's 7 steps to an electric cold call. And I'm just going to cover 3 of the steps that are pattern interrupts here. But essentially I try to be a living and breathing, walking pattern interrupt because I know it's to my advantage. The more that people are paying attention to you, but not for the wrong reasons, the more effective you're going to be. So the first name of the game in today's day and age is, do they actually notice you? Emails, are rampant more than ever. So back in the day, essentially people just had to be relevant once they were in the room because they could only, drive to so many offices at once and knock on the door and sit down with the prospect. Nowadays, the question has been introduced of how do I stand out because there's so many emails here. So interrupting the pattern for cold call, the first way that I'm interrupting the pattern is I'm reading my prospect's emotional cues. So for example, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, it usually doesn't matter how your prospect is sounding. Doesn't matter if they're sounding happy, they're sounding sad, they're sounding upset. The prospector will typically blow straight through that regardless of what that emotional cue is, and they'll go on to their pitch. So the first way that I interrupt this pattern is I have three different options for how to counter if someone sounds unemotional, meaning they sound static. And then 3 different responses if they do sound like they have an emotion. So if they have an emotion and they sound upset, whether that's a question that they ask or a statement that they say, then I essentially pattern interrupt there and say, "Hey, can I level with you? You sound upset. Did I mess up? Did I mess up in calling you?" And usually what you hear your prospect say is, "No, it's not you. It's just X, Y, and Z." And they go into some kind of explanation. And if I had to guess why they take that footing, even though they just sounded like they were mad, it's because you just stopped the pattern that you are a SDR, you're a prospector. And you said like, "Okay, I'm going to call a timeout for a second and I'm going to acknowledge this emotional cue by this person." Very unlike a seller to do. So usually you'll hear very positive responses as a result of this. Or if they sound happy, sometimes they'll hear the same thing. Someone says like, "I'm great." And then the prospector goes into, "Great. Well, the reason for my outreach is," I'm like, "Time out. They just gave you an invitation. The invitation was to not be a normal prospector, to step outside of that and be a human with them. And instead of taking that invitation, you just sprint straight through it and rip them right back into sales mentality." So one of the most toxic things to you within the prospecting process is they see you as a seller. The minute they see you as a seller, they can hang up on you, they can ghost you, they can, lie to you, not tell you whenever they're evaluating competitors. But this is a way to acknowledge their emotion. But the key here is to not have any emotion behind it whenever you do. So that's the first way that I'm interrupting the pattern via call. The second way that I'm interrupting the pattern via call is I'm personalizing. So again, even via email and call, the same, saying something like, reason for my outreach is, I saw that you wrote this article where you're talking about X, Y, and Z. I really like this line where you said X. So I was curious to know if you've come across Flip the Script before. This is an antidote to the beginning of the call. So a lot of people, they have deployed my script in the past, and then they're like, so I'm not getting the results that I really want from it. I'm getting pretty good results. They'll be like, share a couple calls with me. And I get to this portion and they start talking about themselves. The reason for my outreach is we're the number one blank. And I'm like, time out. I said to personalize there. They're like, oh, I didn't think you need that. I'm like, why the hell not? It's one of the most important pieces. This is the antidote. No one can hang up on someone who's talking about them. They can hang up on you when you're talking about you. So you have to include some type of data. Again, the pattern is that you have put them on a list and that you don't know them. So this is an extremely effective pattern interrupt over call. If nothing else, from a time investment perspective, they're going to invest the time back to at least listen to you if you've given them the time to research them. And then the third pattern interrupt is giving them the respect of an opt-in. So normally I hear, this is what I would call a prospect pack that I have my reps do. So, after this, I say, so I was curious to know if you've come across Flip the Script before. After I personalize, let's pretend they say no. I take them into what I call a prospect pact. And what that is an agreement with my prospective buyer on where the call is going to go from there and asking for their buy-in. The reason that this is a pattern interrupt is two reasons. Either number one, the prospector typically just starts pitching without asking for any kind of buy-in. And number two, the sneakier culprit that I've seen recently in the industry is people say like, hey, how about this? How about this? Is it all right if I have the next 20 seconds of yours to explain why I called? And here's why I think it's sneakier. This is an uptick because it is asking for their buy-in, for their permission. But I think it's extremely important that you are bartering in your prospect pact. So if I say, would you be okay if you gave me for the next 20 seconds, let me pitch, there's no get for the prospect. So you always want to make some situation about a get with the prospect. So usually the piece of data that the piece of bartering tool that I'm using at this junction of the call is the number one thing that we want from all sales reps. That is to go away. So I use that as a bargaining chip of my ability, my permanence, and my alacrity of going away is the thing that I'm using to barter with my prospect. So I say, so how about this? You give me the next 20 seconds to give you my best dog and pony show on who we are and why I thought we might be a good fit for you and your team over at Oracle. And at the end of that 20 seconds, you can tell me whether it makes sense to continue the conversation from there. Is that a deal? Another way that you can say this, to give you my best dog and pony show or elevator pitch on who we are and why I thought we might be a good fit. And at the end of that 20 seconds, if you don't like what you hear, I promise my next call won't be announced. Or I promise I'll never call you again. This should, as is, give you about 90 to 95% conversion. But if you want to spike it up to 100, I would barter with your permanence and going away. So I would certainly not make it a one-ended deal. But the point being, this is going to be a pattern interrupt because the normal pattern is either to go ahead and pitch without asking them or to ask for the ability to pitch but not give them any kind of reward in return. So the third type of pattern interrupt, and then we'll go into pattern number 2, is the pattern interrupt of objection handling. So the normal pattern of objection handling is the following. This is what I've seen the most often in the industry, is when your prospect says not the right time, that the prospector says back, when's a better time to call? Or I'm running into a meeting and the prospector apologizes, says, I'm so sorry, when's a better time to call? Or the prospect says, send me an email, and I see the advice of like, oh, just ask them what should I include in that email? I go into this very deeply. I'm going to be very brief here because I'm trying to get off, not get on so many soapboxes recently, but I don't know if I'm effectively doing a good job at it. But the problem with these objection handles is not necessarily that they're bad. The problem with these objection handles is they're handling the wrong objection. Your prospect's usually saying, send me an email because they want you to go away and they don't want to feel like a jerk when they tell it to you. So if you counter with an objection handle of what should I include in the email, it's very similar to saying, that I say, no, I can't go out with you on Friday because I'm washing my hair. And this is like you're sending me shampoo to keep my hair cleaner for longer. Yes, it handles the objection in the moment, but it's not the true objection. But this is the normal pattern. That's what makes me really sad, is this is the normal pattern. But when I go to reps and I ask them, hey, if you were to tell someone to send you an email, do you have any intention on reading that email? They're like, no. Then I'm like, then why'd you say that? Because I wanted to go away. Why didn't you just say that instead? They always say, well, I don't want to feel like a bad person. I'm like, use that data to understand what your prospects actually mean. So this is the pattern of how they expect you to handle these objections. They expect to say, I'm running into a meeting. You might give them a little counter, but you'll get off the phone. So how you can interrupt this, and I go very deep into this, I believe in episode 2, season 3, episode 2, but I need to interrupt the pattern there of what's happening in terms of the objection and call out very directly, but without emotion, what I think is happening in the situation. So again, I go into this very deeply within episode 2, but I'd say something like, can I level with you? Can I be real with you? Can we time out for just a second? I've been hearing send me an email a lot recently, and I'm getting the feeling that's just your polite way of saying, go away, you annoying SDR. That was the worst pitch I've ever heard in my life. Please leave me alone. Did I get that right? And you'll hear your prospects break down. You have just interrupted the pattern of what's normal. And what I think is very, very key about this is that you're not heated about it, number one. But number two, that you say what you think is going on. We are trained to be polite and not tell the truth. So I see a lot of people trying to joke to get out of the pattern. It's like, no, you'll be as counterculture as they come if you just say very politely what you think exactly is happening in the situation. So imagine you get to the end of the date and someone says, it was nice meeting you. I'll give you a call. And the person counters with, I really don't think you're going to because I don't think you had that great of a time. Did I get that right? It would erupt the pattern into a million different pieces. So like at minimum, that person would remember that for the rest of their life. So just being direct, especially when it means a downside to you, but being polite in the meantime is how you can interrupt any single pattern within selling. So I'm getting the feeling it's your polite way of saying, go away, you annoying sales rep. Did I get that right? They'll usually they'll say, yeah, you did. I pick them up with empathy and I say, I get it. It makes sense. I'm sure you're getting 1,000 calls per day. How about this? And I take them into the prospect pack. You give me the next 20 seconds to give you my best dog and pony show on who we are and why I thought we might be a fit. And at the end of that 20 seconds, you can tell me whether it makes sense to continue the chat from there. Does that sound like a deal? So effectively, that's how I'm interrupting the pattern for objection handling. So that was pattern 1. And pattern 1, again, was a prospector and a prospect. And how we interrupted that was over email with personalization, over call with having a personalized reason for outreach, giving double click on emotional cues, and then also giving the opt-in, the respective and opt-in process with a prospect pact. And then we did objection handling, which was how we interrupted that was with an off-record pattern interrupt. And we very politely, but directly told them what we thought was going on in the room. So the second pattern I wanted to go into is the pattern of a buyer and a seller. So there are a number of different attributes that a seller has, usually none of them positive. So if you go and you look up the term seller and online, you'll see 42 different definitions. 41 of them are negative. Only one of them is not negative, and it's neutral. It's not even so sad. Sorry, I think I just snorted. Sometimes I think I'm Sheldon Cooper on The Big Bang Theory. Like the way Anywho, I'm a dweeb. So pattern 2 is buyer and seller. So seller, people are normally going to look at a seller in a very negative context, that they're going to lie to them, that they're going to push them, that they're going to sell them things you don't need. So I wanted to go into the 6 different thoughts that people are thinking about you as a seller and how to interrupt those patterns for them so they see you as something completely different than the normal, typical, sleazy, pushy sales rep that they normally see. So the first one is I to set the stage here, I feel like I need to take a step back and understand why there is this inherent mistrust between buyers and sellers. So it's very simple. It's not a personality thing. I would not make this about us. It has nothing to do with your characteristics. It has something simply to do with your goal. So goal of a buyer is to solve the most amount of problems with the fewest amount of products, to buy those products at the cheapest ticket price that will achieve their goal, and to buy it at a lower relative price than other people. The goal of a seller is to sell the most amount of products to the most amount of people at the highest ticket item for the biggest deal size possible to the most customers, and to sell it at the most customers possible within their TAM. So these goals are, make no mistake, mutually exclusive. You cannot sell something at $100 and the buyer buys it at $80. So one of these parties wins and one of these parties lose, dependent on, and there's a level of scale. So we will withhold information within that process, within the normal pattern of a buying and selling dynamic, because we don't trust the other person. So Eric Berne wrote a book called Games People Play back in the 60s, absolutely groundbreaking. I would definitely suggest picking it up. But what he understood was that there is a game being played within buying and selling. And that's why people don't like it. So essentially within a game, you have two opposing parties that withhold information from one another because their goals are mutually exclusive. If I win, you lose. You win, I lose. And the same is true within buying and selling. So because my goal is to buy something at a low price and your goal is to sell it at a high price, I withhold information so that I can play the game the most effectively. So I actually got to go to Vegas recently and do an SKO. I got to speak at the MGM Grand, which was really, really fun. And when I was doing so, basically the client said like, hey, we want to give you this stipend for money for you to play poker. I am very, very risk averse by nature, oddly enough. So I said like, okay, I'm going to do some studying for this. So I read a number of different books. Now you're going to get really a picture of how nerdy I am. I read a number of different books on different kind of tells within poker. Predominantly, one of the books I really enjoyed was Poker Tells, Verbal Poker Tells, and Auditory Poker Tells, Visual Poker Tells by Zachary Elwood. And he goes into the different types of tells that people give. And what I mean by a tell is basically a leading indicator or a sign that someone is either bluffing or that they have a really, really good hand. And what he understood was that the 95% of tells, whether those be verbal, auditory tells of things that I'm saying that make an update of my position, or visual cues, are given voluntarily because people cannot essentially keep it in. They're so excited about their hand, or they want to, essentially the majority of the information that they give away to another player that makes their player have an advantage on them is because they were just too dumb to just keep it in. So essentially, there are a certain amount of tells within selling as well, but a buyer and a seller are both going to withhold information within this game of buying and selling because they do not trust each other. They want to win the game. They want to, win the goal of either a lower or higher tag price. And so they will withhold a lot of the information because of it. So one of the most damaging things we're going to get into in a second is sellers or buyers are starting to withhold their pain and their problems. So we don't know what we're solving for because they know that gives them leverage in a situation. So the first thing that a buyer would withhold is, do they have any true intention of buying your product? Or when do they plan on buying? Are they the decision maker? How much budget do they have? What happens needs to happen internally for them to be able to buy? Are they evaluating competitor? What plans do they have internally to make any kind of initiative move? What problems do they have and what pains do they have, and facts about their business because of it? So again, the access to this information inherently is what's going to help you diagnose and solve a problem. It's necessary for you as a seller. Your buyer is going to withhold this from you, though, because they don't trust you. And they don't trust you because you have a goal to sell them stuff and they know that. So I always usually stress with people, the more that you can, quote unquote, get your buyer to trust you by displaying trustworthy behavior, that they can trust you're telling the truth, trust that you possess ability that they don't have, and trust that you are reliable enough to deliver on what you said you could, the better off you're going to be. So the more you can interrupt this pattern of what sellers normally do, the more thumbs up they're going to be and the more access to information they're going to give you. So I normally tell people, especially within the sales community, that a good litmus test that you aren't selling effectively and that they feel that you're trying to close them is they'll start to choke back information. So usually I take it as a great sign. I got to co-sell a deal recently with someone. And when I jumped on the call, he said, okay, so by the end of that call, I had the person telling me who we were competing against, what it was looking like, what were the downsides in using that competitor instead of us, how long they had been thinking about it. Were they thinking about moving forward, like X, Y, and Z, all of this information. And the co-seller said, how did you get that from them? And I said, I didn't get it from them. I led with I told him at one point, I said, hey, I don't think you need us for this. So I established credibility and rapport with them there by saying like, hey, here's something that's not advantageous to me, but I'm going to tell that to you. So it started increasing their level of trust in me that I was telling the truth. So point being, a good litmus test that they are not seeing you as a seller is that they start voluntarily offering up information that they normally wouldn't tell a salesperson. So pains, problems, where in the buying cycle they are, how much budget do they have. So I think it's a great litmus test. A lot of times within deals, I'll even say like, hey, I don't know if this is an awkward question, but do you have a specific budget allotted? Like, this is at the end, post-discovery, post what I know we're solving for. I'm like, did you have a pre-allocated amount that was allotted for this? And they'll usually tell me. And that's a good litmus test, of like, okay, they trust me at this point. This information a seller is going to withhold is, does the product actually work? Do they need that? Does that prospect need that feature? Is it in their best interest to buy? What are the typical results from a product? If they have a feature that they stated, is it truly on the roadmap? What's the list price? How much can they discount? But point being, there's an inherent toxic relationship between buyer and seller. And I would say, make no mistake, buyer and seller are at war. They're at war because their goals are mutually exclusive and because I cannot win as a seller and you win the exact same time to the exact same amount as a buyer because our goals are mutually exclusive. So I'd say interrupting the pattern that you are a typical seller is going to do you the most favors within the selling cycle. So let's go in exactly how you can do this. This is my wonderful little graph. There is no overlap between the two of what we want. So the first pattern that I would interrupt as a seller is that I'm going to, the perception, the very true perception and real perception that's most often accurate is that sellers will sell buyers things that they don't need and withhold negative aspects about their products in the process. So how you can counteract this. So I'm going to go into several ways of how you can counteract this theory that's not very typical that people do this within the sales cycle. But I would tell them when you wouldn't buy in a situation. I would tell them things your company doesn't actually do that they thought you could do. Something that you don't do well. I would downsell them on products that they don't need, that they suggested that they need, and apologizing for something that you did. All of these are behaviors that are not normal for a seller. Because again, they're goaled on how many products can they sell and at how high of a ticket price. So I love it when someone says like, hey, I need a methodology for my closers to close discovery on. And I'm like thinking in my head, I'm like, great, I can recommend to them someone else. Or when I see something that they say they need, and I think, great, they actually don't need that from my view. Because I can make deposits at that point and say, actually, and with all good intent and integrity, actually, based on what I'm hearing, I don't think you need this. I'll sell it if you really want it for some other reason to you, but I would not be doing you any favors if I didn't tell you that. And in that moment, I can feel the tide shift within the conversation. They know at that point that I have their back, that I am team prospect. I am with them trying to achieve their goals at the cheapest possible rate, that they want to achieve their goals within. So in this case scenario, I cannot think of, and I do this quite frequently, I cannot think truly of a deal where I did not do this, where they didn't fight to purchase me anyway. And even if not in the moment, they'll usually come back like 2 months later and be like, hey, I know that you turned me down. And then they'll aggressively try to buy me for something else, because it's so rare that a seller will do this, that will tell them the truth. So this can be extremely potent. The other side note to it, and then we can move on. You feel great as a seller. You're like, I'm on my prospect's back. When I downsell them and I tell them actually the cheap, like I love doing this. When people say like, hey, I'm looking for X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, hey, I can sell you this training package, but here's the thing. I think that you can get based on what you're telling me, the lion's share of the value by watching this free video here. Let me know if you have any questions, but why don't you start here? And based on that video, then you can tell me, if you want to move forward into something more aggressive. But I think that the lion's share of what you need is within this video. They watch the video. It's for free. It's great. Because I feel like I helped them in that moment of like, hey, you actually don't need to spend this money. Spend this money on something, more that will help you get to the goals that you're after, that you are bereft of, that there is no option for. So this is how you can counteract that first pattern. The second pattern of a buyer and seller is that sellers only show up, true story, when there's something in it for them. So this is a major pattern. I have seen it, time and time again, is people check in with their prospects that they haven't talked to in 11 months on November 28th or December 1st, because the renewal is happening on January 1st and they're worried about it. So the way to counteract this, it's very, very simple. I would add some piece of value that has nothing to do with you and is not a win for you, and do this regularly with your clients and with your prospects. So you can counteract this, and here's a list of things that you can send them: a client for them, network introductions, gifts, non-company related events, communities they can join, book list, podcast, webinar, article, asterisk mark, double, triple asterisk mark here on any of the content. I would say avoid any kind of content that was published by your company, avoid any kind of content that was talking well about you, and avoid any kind of content that was promoting the value prop of what your company does. And time again, I train on this. I say it cannot be published by your company. It cannot be about your value prop. It cannot be about, your use case, but published by someone else justifying that your use case, that your product is beneficial to people in the workplace. I go through the worksheets and I train on this for 30 minutes. Then I go to the worksheets, I kick everyone out into a workshop, and I come back, and 85% of the time, the person has put an article published by their company or an article published about their value prop. It is very ingrained in us to only talk about stuff that is a positive for us as a seller. That we're more valid, we're more valuable, they should buy. But I'd say you can effectively interrupt this pattern time and time again if you're adding value that's valuable to them, that has nothing to do with you being great. There is one person that I constantly I'm thinking of him right now. His name is Dan Smith over at Winning by Design. It is arguably a competitor of mine. And at one point he was a trainer. He was training me. And he did this a number of times. He still does this to this day, even though hypothetically we're competitors. And we're running a half marathon in late March together. And it's because of the friendship that we have, because he was constantly driving and adding value. And it never had anything to do with him. It never had anything to do with me needing sales training or, them being a great company, et cetera, et cetera. It was always stuff that was valuable to me. And the conversation was never about him and how great he was. He would constantly flip the conversation into one about me. It has turned him into a very trusted friend and I would say mentor of mine because he was doing things like this. He was constantly seeking to me when I was a client of his, and still to this day, even though I'm hypothetically a competitor of his, he is still doing this kind of thing, where he's adding value. So I say, if you can have a lifestyle of not making the conversation about you, but truly adding value to your prospective buyers in the process, you would be absolutely floored in my experience of what their response is, because now how they see you. So the third pattern that I'd be after interrupting is that sellers only talk about themselves, myself included. I have been a very, very high arbiter of this sin, but this is the next pattern to interrupt. So here's some quick tips. Number one, I would avoid talking about how awesome your company is, even though it's not about you. It's still in relation about you. So that's talking all about case studies, talking all about how wonderful you are, how everyone's a raving fan, how everyone just absolutely loves you because you're the number one, da-da-da-da. I would save it. Marketing from a one-to-many perspective, if it's on a billboard, I still don't love it. But it's better than hearing it one-to-one. On the sales floor, I don't think there's any room for it. Number one, because I think it's arrogant and people rebel against it. But number two, if you're talking about you, two things that are not happening is you're not talking about them and they're not talking. Two big no-nos in sales, right? So I either want to be talking about them or I want them to be talking, right? Those are the two goals. You already know about you. So I hear a lot of this, within speakers that they'll have 6 or 7 slides at the beginning of about me section slides. And I'm like, no offense, it doesn't matter who it is. No one really cares. Dive into the content. So don't talk about how great your company is. Just be great in the process, and let them make that assumption. Let them make that comment. So not talking about how great your company is. Avoid saying you're the number one. I've never seen someone say we're the number 2 blank in the market. Focusing on your prospect in the conversations. When you're giving social proof, make your customer the hero as opposed to you. Or highlighting, I love to do this, of when I get to post really great content that was written by someone, out in the community, especially if I don't know them, that I'm like, hey, you can, I would check out this article. This author is amazing. I love when I get to do that. Number one, because I get to highlight another author. But number two, it's exhausting from an emotional view ever to talk about yourself. Make the story hum a different tune. Make the story about others around you, and the great things that they're doing, in the process. So this can be a great pattern interrupt if you're constantly making the conversation about the prospect within the way things that they're doing, great things your customers are doing, where they're the hero, you are just the tool, but this can effectively interrupt that pattern of how them seeing you as a seller. I will say on a side note here, and this is a triple asterisk mark, you're going to have to interrupt the buyer seller pattern early, and you're going to have to interrupt it often. Every call, I'd say you need to at least have 2 or 3 of these, because it's so ingrained in us to see that person as the sleazy because of our experience with sellers. So I'd say this isn't a one and done exercise, but this will turn you into a different person and a different seller whenever you're getting to have the privilege of doing things like this. And then the last one here is the pattern is that sellers don't know much about their buyers. This is a massive pattern. It's very, very true. I don't come across a lot of sellers who know an inherent amount about their buyers, and it's really sad. They usually, what they know the most about is sales technique of like how to push people, or also their product. And that's what they crave. They'll say product knowledge is number 1. It's the thing that I need to know more about. So this pattern you can effectively interrupt by know your buyer. Know your buyer. Sounds easy. It's more complex than that, though. I would know their metrics, know things that they're metriced on. So a sales rep is metriced on close one ACV, or an SDR is metriced on booked meetings, qualified meetings. I would know that. I would know your buyer's common problems and challenges that they run into in their role. Know what's relevant to your buyer statically. So, segment of, are they enterprise, general business, mid-market, SMB, or what kind of vertical are they in? I would know what's going on with them in relationship to you, meaning did they request a demo but didn't actually schedule one? Did they download some content? Did they attend a webinar of yours? Did they attend an event? There's a multitude of plays you can run. If you go into the written hub in the Comprehensive Encyclopedia of Sales Plays, there are 139 actions and triggers that your prospect can take that I would be aware of. And then knowing what's going on with them not in relationship to you. So this is their company IPO'd or received company funding, way to go. Or, they moved headquarters or opened new locations. It is jarring to listen to these sales conversations and like a company just went public and a seller's on the phone with them and they didn't know. And I'm like, dude, like they do, the prospect does. So this is where I feel like sellers, they feel like, and I've been in a part of this school of thought of like, I'm aggressive as a seller, and I need to be aggressive about my follow-up. And I'm like, take the same level of aggression. And then I've heard some sales training that says like, have a detached outcome. Don't care about where the conversation goes. Have an open hand with the outcome that happens. I'm like, let me be very clear. We are marketed on how many deals we sell. So you need to have an intent. You need to have intention and you need to be aggressive. But you need to channel that aggression into how much you know about your buyer and how much value you add and how much you understand them, how much you solve their problems, and how much you help them because of that. If you can do those 5 things, you've just changed the face of selling. You're aggressive about knowing them, helping them, understanding them, offering value, and solving their problems. You're not a seller anymore. Because a seller is aggressive about pushing products down your throat, follow-up emails, and getting the deal done at the highest dollar amount. So this effectively, if you're an expert, and the great news is, people sometimes say, well, I'm not a CTO. So like, how can I know about, a very technical buyer persona back? And I'm like, here's the great thing. I usually, if I'm in a big room, I say like, okay, we're all sellers in here. We're all SDRs in here, etc. How many of you in here know everything there is to know about selling? No one raises their hand. I've never seen someone raise their hand. Thank God. Oh my gosh. I don't know what to do if I did meet someone. And I say myself included. I don't know everything there is to know about selling. Not even close. Here's the great thing is, your buyers are in the same shoes. Even though they're a CTO, doesn't mean that they know everything about being a CTO. They don't necessarily know about new mandates that came into place. They don't necessarily know about a new way to do something or a new metric that's going to be coming into place or something they should be watching out for. So the great news is when you get to know your buyers, I wouldn't be intimidated of like, they're an SDR, so they know everything there is to know about sales development. There is a wealth of information that they don't have that they wish that they did, and they're thankful to the people who do present that type of information to them. So the last pattern I'm going to go into, and then we're going to close out. This is a pattern that's very psychologically driven. So this pattern is the pattern of the parent and child ego state. So for this, I want to go into briefly into the 3 different ego states and then 2 different patterns of ways that you can interrupt it. I would be remiss if I did not mention, and I will mention his name every single day, I think until the day I die. I love Eric Berne's work. So Eric Berne is known as the father of transactional analysis. He wrote a number of different books. He was a psychologist back in the 60s. And he essentially, his 2 best books from my perspective are Games People Play and Beyond Games and Scripts. And what he understood was 2 things inherently before anyone else understood them. That I believe most sales training and methodology are actually based off of, whether we know it or not. Different discussion for a different time. But he understood that there are 3 different ego states in everyone's body. And he also understood that there's an inherent amount of games that people play within roles between one another. So the 3 different ego states, he understood because he was studying people who were flipping between different personalities and viewing one person, the same person, in some cases as an authority, in some cases as a peer, and in some cases as someone who is submissive to them. So he understood that there were 3 different ego states, and these are ego states that we flux in and out of the entire, day long. So there is no one who is bereft of flexing into these ego states, and no one who stays in one ego state all the time. So it's dependent upon where we are at in the moment, and the stimulus around us. So the first is parent ego state. This is behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that are copied from your parents or parental figures, authoritative figures whenever you were younger. So there are 2 sides of this ego state, nurturing and controlling. And the nurturing parent ego state essentially seeks to organize some system of safety in order to create safety. So the agenda is on the child ego state, and it's to create some type of system of order to take care of the child. The controlling side of the ego state is the authoritative piece. It is the disciplinarian. And essentially, it is trying to create a system for someone, for the child. But essentially, the system, when they create it, they're trying to get the child to comply to that system. Both goals are the same. It's to take care of the child. It's just more of a good cop, bad cop feel of like, one time I'm going to nurture them, and one way that I'm going to seek for compliance to get them in some kind of ambiguous direction. So this ego state is characterized by its agenda is on the child ego state to impact the child ego state. And it is ridden with emotion. And this ego state will typically lie to you, or the child ego state. It'll say Santa's not real, or no, we took that dog to a farm, where it's running around with other puppies and there's green grass, when really the dog went to the pound because it peed on the carpet for the 18th time. But point being, this ego state will lie to protect the child. And also, this ego state is ridden with emotion. The child ego state is behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that we had replayed as a child. And there are 2 sides to it. Natural and adaptive. Natural is extremely emotional, extremely creative, extremely spontaneous, seeks to have fun, brings the life to the party, wants to get everyone excited. Any kind of joking is based in the child natural ego state, and any kind of desire is based in the child natural ego state. And then the second piece here is the adaptive ego state. So the child adaptive ego state essentially is rebellious, insecure by nature, and it seeks to undermine authority and and go against the crowd. And the reason it's doing that is because it wanted a system of control. It wanted a system of discipline as a communication that it was being focused on, and safety, didn't get one. And it was pissed off, so it started to rebel in both of these cases, the goal is to get the attention of the parent ego state. So in one way, I'm doing it to make jokes, have fun, be the life of the party, but it's to get the parent ego state attention. And adaptive, it's to rebel and undermine to get the attention of the parent ego state. Also ridden with emotion, also a lie. I didn't eat that cookie, dog ate my homework. No, I didn't sneak out and go out with my friends. Wink, wink, mom. Hope you were not watching this. No, those tire tracks wasn't because I was off-roading on Bluebonnet Trail in the middle of Plano whenever I was 15 years old, and that's why I didn't make it to soccer practice. That definitely wasn't me. Wink, wink also happened. Point being, you lie within both of these ego states. Parent, you're trying to impact the child ego state and you are ridden with emotion. Child, the same thing. You're trying to impact the parent ego state by way of getting its attention. And the way that you do this is by seeking it either through natural or adaptive ways. In the middle, this also has a lot of emotion. In the middle is the adult ego state. The adult ego state is the holy grail of ego states. It is responsible for, in response to the thoughts and behaviors of the here and now. It's all about the present. It's plan heavy, analytical, logical, rational, pragmatic. And all it seeks to do is to understand more. Has no emotion. There is I'm probably going to disrupt a couple of people's days. There is a very big difference between being a good parent and being mature. Being a good parent just means you can be responsible enough to take care of another human being. Being mature is a completely different skill set that essentially is based on an emotional maturity. So just because I can take care of a fish or a puppy or a child, it doesn't mean that I have emotionally matured and progressed. So the adult ego state is where you need to get with your prospect. And this is the pattern interrupt in and of itself. The majority of us, the majority of our day, it's dependent on the human, but are in parent and child ego state. And the general rule of thumb here is people say that you cannot change someone else. And I agree a little bit, mostly disagree. You can't change someone else, but you have a really, really good shot at it if you change yourself. So how you change someone else is by changing the way that you are acting, and then it typically will change the way that they are acting in tandem. So each one of these ego states ascends and calls out to another ego state in the other person. So if you are in parent nurturing, you trigger them into natural, child natural. If you are in parent controlling, then you trigger them into adaptive, and so on and so forth. So a great example of controlling to adaptive, if I said, do not push this button, everything will rear up in your head and say, I want to push the button. And it's like, why? I don't know. She told me not to. So, I mean, same exact thing on the way back. Natural is to nurturing and adaptive is to controlling. So if I'm rebelling, for instance, so a great example of this, and I usually put these in within here, I put a spelling mistake here, emotive instead of, or emptive instead of emotive, or sometimes I'll kick one of the letters down to the ascending line. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of baiting people a little bit. If you correct me, then it means you're in the child adaptive ego state. You're seeking to undermine the presenter by calling out a spelling mistake, because what you're really looking for is attention. So you can cause your prospect to be in one of these other ego states. So great example, if you're in parent ego state and you're in nurturing or you're in controlling, you're either best case scenario going to disempower your prospect, and worst case scenario, you're going to make them rebel. So if I say, let me know what time works for you, it triggers them into child adaptive ego state and makes them not want to let me know what time works for them. The other case scenario, if I'm in child, then I'm going to flex your prospect into parent ego state, and they're more likely to say the one word that parents say more often to their kids than any other word in the English or any kind of language dictionary. And that word is N-O. So if I'm in parent, I make sure I increase the likelihood that they'll rebel or feel placated, which are both no good. And if I'm in child, I make sure that I am influxing increasing the reality that they're going to say no to me. So the pattern that needs to be interrupted, and here are some examples. I'm going to lead you to see some of these within the deck. I'm not going to go into them today, but let me know. It's very slight, but it's a command, and it makes them want to rebel. Give me a call back later. Trying to get someone to pull them to do something. Great example would be, sign here, or leading questions. Leading questions. Asking them accountability questions. Did you see my last email? Did you get my last voicemail? Did you see that I called? Any of this is going to flex them into the child ego state. And also here are some examples of the way back. Trying to ask any leading questions to your prospects, insulting them, saying they're not the decision maker, blaming them for something. There's a number of different examples in here, but essentially the pattern that you want to interrupt, because again, both of these are going to be disadvantageous to you. So if you notice that they're in one of these, the effective thing to do that you need to do, from my perspective, to increase the likelihood of a sale is to interrupt both of these and to get into the adult ego state. So I see a lot of back and forth, and I saw this the other day. Someone said online, they were like, I called out that one of my least favorite questions is, does that make sense? The reason I said that is you're questioning and you're challenging that the prospect has a high ability for comprehension. And it was funny because in the thread, I see a couple of different people be like, well, I don't think that that's right. And I think that that's not incorrect, or that's not correct, and on and on. And it was just really interesting to watch because I'm like, here's child ego state thread, like bam, 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 within 15 comments. So I would say from this perspective, I would defer to Eric Berne's work. He is a wealth of information, but essentially the pattern that needs to be interrupted. And again, both are hallmarked that you are very, very emotional. So if you have no emotion and you're asking questions to understand someone, it's a good hallmark that you're an adult ego state. Other than that, if you're seeing riled up emotions, you're like, screw you, I'm going home. Then essentially it's a good hallmark that you are in a ego state that is going to increase the likelihood from a psychology view that you are going to either get a no, or they're going to rebel against whatever you want them to do or not to do. So how you can interrupt this is a number of different examples that are listed here. The prospect pack, the elephant in the room, classic role diffusion, what changed, pulling down the covers, maybe it's me. I cover a lot of these in season 1 on ego states where I go very deep. But the basic thing that I do from the high level is, again, you need to stop the pattern from happening, to Bloom Zeigarnik's point, stop the pattern from happening. And how I do this, number one, is I say, can I level with you? Can I be real with you? Can we time out for just a second? Can I tell you something? May I say something? And you need to stop the pattern of what's ever is happening in the conversation. So if your prospect you feel like is saying like, oh, well, we'll get back to you with this, or I'll call you, you just wait on our call. And you feel like something's not right. You're like, I screwed up this deal and this is not going to pan out in my favor. Or they say like, send me an email, and you're feeling in your gut, you're like, they're not going to read that email. A great way to interrupt that pattern, because again, parent will lie to you to protect you, and child will lie to you, saying that this is a great email when they're not going to buy, and child will lie to you to rebel. So essentially, you have to stop that pattern. Can I level with you? Can I be real with you? Can we time out for just a second? Can I tell you something? May I say something? And I would be assumptive in nature. Maybe it's me, but I get the feeling that, is it just me? Or I don't know, I feel like, or correct me if I'm wrong, say some type of assumptive language, and then say exactly what you think is going on in the situation, but the marker is without emotion. You cannot have emotion in it. So if I say, and I say this all the time in the sales cycle, I'm like, hey, can we time out for a second? I don't know, maybe it's me, but I get the feeling that I blew it earlier in the sales cycle, and now you're very fairly going with my competitor. Did I get that right? Because I couldn't get my crap together. Did I get that right? And they'll break down. They'll go, yeah. I'm like, who are you going with? And they're like, blank. And I'm like, okay, if you don't mind me asking, so what put them apart? What did they do really well? If you put me out of my misery. And they'll be like, well, it wasn't what they did well. It's that they do this, this, and this, and you don't. And I'm like, well, now I feel like a really bad seller. They're like, why? I'm like, because we actually do that. And all of a sudden, even if you don't get the objection handled, at least you're talking about up-to-date real information, because both of these are going to be shell ego states, but the truth is not in the room. I did eat the cookie, and the dog is not going to a farm. He's at the pound, right? So you want to surface what is really happening in the room. So, I hear this with sellers a lot. It's like, you don't know what that information is. And I think the 5 most important minutes of any meeting is the 5 minutes after you walk out of the sales room and the prospect turns to their other prospect internally and says, what do you think? And then they tell the truth. They're like, I really liked this, but I didn't like this. She seems a little arrogant, her skirts are kind of weird and they're a little wrinkled. And they tell the truth about what they're thinking. Your access to that information predicates your efficacy as a seller. So the more that they see you as a seller, the more they see you as a prospector, the more that you are doing those behaviors, or the more they see you in the child adaptive or parent ego state, the less likely they are to give you information, because they're like, they can't handle it. They can't handle that information. I can't trust them with it. So this is a great way. If you notice, if there is any heat in what they're saying, they're either in the child or they are in the parent ego state. So a great example of this is when prospects right off the bat, when you call into them and they say, "How did you get my information?" And then I almost said child, the prospector answers them, "Oh, Zoom info." And it's like, they're in parent ego state, man. They're like, "Why is this door still like, did you leave this door open last night?" They picked up the call not knowing who you were, and they found out that it was a seller, and they are ready to get off the call. So in that case scenario, they are really, essentially, they're rebelling against you, and they're giving you a communication that they're in the wrong ego state. So don't answer their question. It wasn't an adult ego state question. They weren't after understanding. They're in the wrong ego state. So you need to interrupt that pattern, from my view, and get them out of the ego state so that you have a chance. So that is everything for the presentation. In summary, I know that a lot of selling and buying and selling is going to come down to, are you relevant? What's the value prop? Are you solving for the problems that they need to solve? But here's 3 very, very typical patterns that have been introduced as of late. The reason they've been introduced is people are so inundated with new, whether that's outreach via email or outreach via call. They have so much volume coming into them that the first thing that we need to do to stand out is to interrupt the pattern, to the brilliant Bloom and Zeigarnik's point, and to stand out as a seller, someone who's after their best interests, someone who's trying to add value, someone who will downsell them whenever it's appropriate, and someone who will be bold enough to stand a little bit outside of the fold. So that is everything. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this session and you want to hear more, if you go to flipthescript.co, and you can download all kinds of different sessions where we cover everything from tactical selling to KPI systems to process. But either way, I really appreciate you tuning in today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.